The sign was nailed crooked above the wooden porch, its black paint peeling under the relentless western sun. The words were bold enough for every ranch hand and drifter passing through to see. Choose any bride for free. The letters almost mocked the dusty street below, where townsfolk lingered in half-curious silence, their eyes fixed on the line of young women gathered like cattle at an auction. Some clutched their skirts nervously, some kept their heads down. And one stood tall, despite the iron shackles biting her wrists. She was Comanche, her dark eyes steady, unbroken, and she seemed out of place against the backdrop of timber storefronts and sagging saloons. The sheriff leaned on a post across the street, chewing tobacco, pretending not to care but watching everything. He knew the kind of trouble that always followed when men with money and guns came sniffing around promises like these. The traveling showman who had arranged the brides was already clapping his hands together. A grin stretched wide across his round face. His vest strained with sweat. His laughter was too loud, and yet the crowd listened when he spoke. "Gentlemen," he called out, "this here's your chance. No fees, no debts, no running around courting. Today, you walk away with a wife at no cost." The crowd muttered, half in disbelief, half in hunger. Farmers who had lost wives to fever, ranchers who lived alone on endless miles of prairie, prospectors who had no company but the dust, they all felt something stir at those words. In a land where loneliness stretched as wide as the horizon, a promise like that was more than tempting. Yet, whispers curled like smoke between the onlookers. Was it legal? Was it moral? Did anyone care? 3 girls stood nearest the front. 2 were pale, thin, their dresses faded, their faces tired from travel or hardship. They shifted uneasily, avoiding the stares of men who sized them up like mares at a fair. But the third, the Comanche girl, did not look away. Her shoulders were squared, her jaw tight, and her silence spoke louder than any plea. She wore no shoes, her ankles dusted red from the long walk, and the sun glinted off the chain that bound her wrists. Her presence was a challenge, though no one said it aloud. The cowboy stepped forward then, spurs jangling against the cracked boards. He wasn't the richest man in town, nor the loudest. His hat was worn, brim frayed, dust coating his boots, but his eyes were sharp, and his voice carried when he finally spoke. "I'll take her," he said, pointing straight at the shackled girl. The crowd gasped, some laughing nervously, some muttering curses under their breath. The showman's grin faltered, but only for a heartbeat before it returned, wider than ever. "Her?" he asked, feigning surprise, though his eyes darted nervously to the sheriff. Now, friend, you've got choices here. Look at these other beauties. Why settle on the one who might claw your eyes out in your sleep?" But the cowboy didn't flinch. His jaw was set, his hand resting near the butt of his revolver. The sheriff shifted, his eyes narrowing, but he still said nothing. Everyone was waiting, breath held, as if the whole town leaned on the edge of something sharp. The Comanche girl didn't move, didn't blink. If she felt fear, it was buried deep, hidden behind the calm fire of her stare. The cowboy's words had placed her fate on a thin line, and whether he meant to save her or claim her, no one yet knew. The showman chuckled again, though now his laughter rang hollow. "Well, sir," he said, spreading his arms wide, "if that's your choice, then by all means. She's yours." And just like that, the dusty street grew quieter, the sun heavy overhead. The sound of distant horses and creaking wagons, the only noise. Men shifted uneasily. Women whispered from doorways and somewhere. A dog barked once before falling silent. The cowboy took a step closer, boots thudding against the wood. The girls' chains rattled softly as the breeze carried grit through the air. Neither of them spoke, yet the moment carried more weight than all the showman's boasting. In that silence, a question hung heavier than the heat itself. Had the cowboy just saved her life or stolen it for himself? The answer waited in the dust, in the iron shackles, in the eyes of a girl who refused to bow. In the town, every last soul leaned forward to see what would happen next. The cowboy stood tall under the noon sun, his shadow stretching long across the boards as he faced the girl in shackles. Dust swirled at his boots, carried by the dry wind that seemed to hush the town into stillness. The showman still wore his grin, but it trembled at the edges like paint peeling off old wood. Nobody quite knew what would happen next. Men squinted from the shade of saloon porches, women peeked from behind curtains, and children clung to their mothers' skirts. The street felt like a stage where every word, every step, carried weight that might tip the balance toward trouble. The Comanche girl didn't move, didn't flinch at the cowboy's voice or his pointed hand. Her silence had a strength in it, a kind of defiance that unsettled the crowd. She was not like the other women lined up. She carried herself as if she were not here to be chosen, not here to be bartered. The iron biting at her wrists was a cruel reminder of her place in this strange display, but her eyes told a different story. They burned steady, fixed on the cowboy, as though she were testing him, measuring the man who dared to claim her. The cowboy's name wasn't spoken yet. Folks in town knew him, or thought they did. He had ridden into Dry Creek a year back with little more than a weathered horse, a long rifle, and the kind of eyes that saw too much. He worked odd jobs when he needed coin rounding, up cattle, fixing fence lines, driving wagons. Some said he was running from something, maybe from blood spilled somewhere farther west. Others figured he was just another drifter, looking for a patch of land to settle. No one ever asked him outright because there was a kind of quiet warning in his gaze that told folks not to pry too deep. And now here he was, pointing to a shackled Comanche girl as though he were making a choice he'd been waiting his whole life to make. The sheriff spat a dark line of tobacco juice into the dust, his eyes never leaving the scene. He had seen enough strange dealings in his years, but this one carried a weight that made his gut churn. He knew the showman, a slick-tongued peddler who drifted from town to town, always with some scheme that turned heads and lined his pockets. The sign nailed up above the porch was his doing, bold and shameless. Yet the sheriff also knew the town was hungry, not for food, but for wives, for companionship, for any scrap of softness in a land that turned men hard and left them lonely. This scheme had pulled them in like moths to lantern light, and now it threatened to spark something none of them could control. The two pale girls beside the Comanche shifted nervously. One clutched the fabric of her dress so tight her knuckles whitened. The other kept her head down as though hoping to vanish altogether. They had been brought here for the same purpose, but they knew the Comanche girl was different. She had not come willing. She had been taken. That much was plain. Her people still roamed the plains beyond town, though their numbers had thinned and their battles with soldiers grew bloodier each year. To see one of their daughters here, shackled and displayed as a bride, was a sight that made even the hardest ranchers uneasy. No one said it aloud, but every man present wondered what storm might break if her kin came riding to reclaim her, the cowboys. Words had cut the air sharp, and though no one dared laugh now, a few whispered, "Why her? Why not one of the pale girls who looked ready to obey, ready to settle into a home without question? Why invite trouble, risk danger by choosing a Comanche girl whose eyes held nothing but challenge?" Some thought he was a fool. Others thought he was braver than all of them. The truth lay hidden behind his calm face, and only he knew what purpose had driven his choice. The showman cleared his throat, his smile stretching thin. "Well, friend," he said, voice booming louder than it needed to, "you've got an eye for fire, I'll give you that. But fire, as you know, can burn a man if he's not careful. Are you sure about this? These other gals? Why, they'll make you fine wives. Quiet, obedient, no trouble at all. But this one," he waved a stubby hand toward the Comanche, "she comes with, let's say, added burdens." The cowboy didn't answer, didn't spare the showman a glance. His eyes stayed locked on the girl, and something unspoken passed between them in that silent exchange. Maybe it was recognition, maybe it was promise, maybe it was warning. The crowd couldn't tell, but they felt it, and it made the air heavier, as if the whole town were holding its breath. Behind them, the church bell tolled once, though no service was set to start. The sound echoed down the street, bouncing off the wooden storefronts, settling into the dust. It was an omen to some, a reminder to others that judgment hung in the air. The sheriff's hand drifted toward his holster, not because he meant to draw, but because he knew how quickly words could turn to bullets in a place like this, The cowboy finally spoke again, his voice low but steady. I said, I'll take her. That was all. No more, no less. It was not a plea, not a boast, but a statement carved into stone. The showman gave a nervous chuckle and looked to the sheriff, as if hoping for rescue. But the lawman only lifted his shoulders in a slow shrug. The town wanted a show, and here it was. Best to let it play out before stepping in. The girl's chains rattled softly as the showman stepped forward, fumbling for a key at his belt. His fat fingers shook as he tried to fit the iron into the lock, and for the first time, the grin slipped fully from his face. He muttered under his breath about business, about deals gone sour, but his words were drowned by the silence pressing in from the crowd. All eyes were on the cowboy and the girl, on the moment that would either bind them together or tear the town apart. The lock clicked, the chain loosened, and the girl pulled her wrists free with a sharp tug. Red welts lined her skin where the iron had cut, but she showed no pain, only raised her chin higher. She did not thank the cowboy, did not move toward him. She stood as if daring him to prove his choice meant something more than possession. The cowboy tipped his hat slightly, the faintest nod, but his face gave away nothing else. He turned then slowly, as if expecting the crowd to part for him, and they did. Men stepped back, women pulled their children closer, and the sheriff's eyes narrowed like a hawk tracking prey. The girl followed, her steps steady, her silence sharper than any words. The two pale girls were led back toward the porch, forgotten in the moment, their futures uncertain as ever. But all attention was fixed on the pair walking into the heat, leaving behind the showman, the sign, and the uneasy whispers of a town that had just witnessed something dangerous. No one knew yet what it meant. Was the cowboy rescuing her or claiming her? Was this the beginning of mercy or the start of bloodshed? The questions hung in the dust, unanswered, as the sun climbed higher and the shadows grew shorter. And somewhere beyond the horizon, where the plains stretched wild and endless, the Comanche people rode under the same sky. Unaware that one of their own had just been chosen in a way that might change everything, the story did not end there. In truth, it was only beginning. The whole town of Dry Creek braced itself for whatever storm was about to break. The street of Dry Creek stayed, silent long after the cowboy and the Comanche girl walked away. Dust still hung in the air where their boots had passed, as if the land itself was unwilling to settle. The townsfolk slowly drifted back into doorways and saloons, murmuring to each other, voices low and uneasy. No one could quite explain what they had just witnessed, but everyone knew it meant trouble. In a town where people lived on thin hope and thinner trust, an act like that had weight. And weight in the wrong place could crush more than just one man's life. The showman stood sweating on the porch, his hands fidgeting, his grin long gone. He tried to draw the crowd back with promises, boasting about the two remaining girls, insisting there was still opportunity, still bargains to be made. But no one listened anymore. The cowboy's choice had shifted the whole scene. Men who had come to claim wives now turned away, muttering excuses about chores, waiting on their ranches. Women shook their heads and hurried children off the street. The showman barked louder, but his words fell flat against the heavy air. The sheriff remained in his place, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the trail of dust left behind. He knew the cowboy's act was no small thing. It wasn't just a man claiming a bride. It was a statement. A challenge, maybe even a spark that could set the town aflame. The Comanche girl was not just another woman desperate for shelter. She was part of a people who had spilled blood against settlers, soldiers, and ranchers alike. Bringing her into town meant carrying that history into every home, every prayer at the church, every deal struck at the saloon. The sheriff spat again, dark and bitter, and told himself he'd need to keep his boots close to the trouble, because the trouble was only beginning. The cowboy led her slowly down the main road, saying nothing. He didn't put his hand on her arm, didn't pull her along. He walked with the steady rhythm of a man who had decided his course and wouldn't be moved from it. The girl followed, her chin lifted, her steps deliberate. She did not walk like someone rescued, nor like someone captured. She walked like someone who would not bend, not even in a place that tried to chain her. The townsfolk who caught glimpses from windows whispered about the sight, how she carried herself, how he moved beside her, how together they looked less like man and bride, and more like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. At the saloon, talk flowed faster than whiskey. Ranch hands leaned on the bar, throwing out guesses about what the cowboy meant to do. Some said he was a fool chasing a fire he couldn't control. Others whispered he might be planning something larger, maybe trading the girl back to her people for favor, or ransom, or peace. One old prospector swore he'd seen the look in the cowboy's eyes before, the look of a man bound to a promise no one else could see. The barkeep just shook his head, polishing the same glass over and over, muttering that nothing good ever came from mixing Comanche blood with town business. Back at the edge of town, the girl's silence was its own kind of voice. She glanced once at the church, once at the blacksmith's forge, once at the fields stretching beyond the last wooden fences. Each look carried thought, calculation, though she spoke no words. The cowboy noticed, though he said nothing. He kept his pace steady, leading her toward the small shack he rented at the far edge of Dry Creek. It wasn't much for walls leaning against each other, a roof that leaked when it rained, a corral where his horse dozed in the sun, but it was away from the main road, away from eyes that measured and judged. That distance mattered. When they reached the shack, the girl stopped at the doorway. She stood in the shadow, her face unreadable. The cowboy pushed the door open, stepping aside to let her choose. She looked at him for the first time since the chains had fallen, her dark eyes sharp and questioning. There was no fear in them, only a quiet demand. Why? He didn't answer with words. Instead, he tipped his hat again, the same small gesture from before, and went inside, leaving the door open behind him. She followed slowly, her steps careful, her gaze sweeping the room like a hawk studying new ground. As night crept in, lanterns flickered across town. The saloon filled, the church bell rang for evening prayer, and talk of the day's strange choosing spread faster than wildfire. Some folks swore the Comanche would come for her by dawn, a war party sweeping through Dry Creek with fire and arrows. Others feared the girl herself, whispering that she might carry curses, or secrets, or knives hidden under her rags. A few argued that maybe the cowboy had saved her, that maybe his act was the one decent thing this town had seen in years. But hope was harder to sell than fear, and fear was the coin most townsfolk chose to carry. The sheriff finally left his post, walking slow through the street, hat pulled low. He stopped at the saloon, at the church, at the store, listening to the whispers, measuring the worry. He knew the balance of a town was fragile as a glass in a storm, and right now, that glass was cracking. He wondered if the cowboy knew what weight he had taken on, or if he'd wake tomorrow to find the whole town against him. Either way, the lawman told himself, his duty was to keep order. Yet deep down, he knew order was a thin rope, and some ropes snapped no matter how tightly you held them. The two pale girls left behind on the porch were taken that night to the boarding house, watched over by the preacher's wife. Their fate hung in the air too, overshadowed by the Comanche girl's presence. They whispered to each other in the dim lamplight, wondering what would become of them, whether anyone would claim them, or whether they'd be left adrift in a town that had already forgotten their names. Meanwhile, in the cowboy's shack, the night was quiet, except for the sound of coyotes far out on the plains. The girl sat by the window, staring into the darkness, her face calm but her mind alive with thought. She had been taken from her people, dragged miles away, bound in chains. Now she sat in a stranger's home, free of iron, but not of questions. She did not know this man, did not trust him, but she had seen something in his eyes that made her pause. It wasn't possession. It wasn't pity. It was something else, harder to name. The cowboy leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her in the lantern's glow. He did not press her with words, did not demand gratitude, did not try to claim what was not his. He simply watched, as though waiting for her to speak first. But she kept her silence, holding it like a shield. And so the night passed with both of them awake, neither willing to break the fragile line drawn between them. Outside, the prairie wind carried whispers of storms to come. The Comanche camps beyond the hills stirred with their own stories, their own fears and anger. Soldiers at the fort a day's ride away kept their rifles close, always wary of new fires breaking on the horizon. And in Dry Creek itself, Men sharpened knives, women prayed harder. Children listened wide-eyed to tales of raids and vengeance. The whole land seemed to breathe in, waiting, holding that breath, knowing it could not last forever. The cowboy had made his choice. The girl had accepted nothing, and the town was caught in the middle. The question of what came next hung like thunderclouds overhead. No one could say whether the storm would break tomorrow or the next day, or if it had already begun. But everyone, from the sheriff to the showman to the children clutching their mother's skirts, felt it pressing closer, step by step, in the dust and silence of a land that did not forgive mistakes. And so the night settled heavy on Dry Creek. The stars sharp above, the ground restless below, while a cowboy and a Comanche girl sat in the dim glow of a lantern, both knowing that what had started today was far from over. The days that followed pressed down on Dry Creek like the still air before a storm. Nothing had yet broken. But everyone felt it close enough that men carried their rifles into the saloon, and women kept lamps burning longer into the night. The cowboy and the Comanche girl had not left town. That alone was enough to make nerves fray. Folks kept waiting to see horsemen crest the ridge, waiting to hear the sound of war cries carried on the wind. But the plains stayed quiet. The silence was heavier than any raid. The cowboy went about his business as if nothing had changed. He still rode out each morning, tending to odd jobs, mending fences, hauling supplies. Yet every eye followed him when he rode through town, and whispers followed after. Some men called him reckless, others dangerous, and a few muttered that maybe he was working some secret deal with the Comanche. At night in the saloon, those whispers turned sharper. There was talk of running him out, of sending the girl away before trouble came crashing down. But no one acted, not yet. Fear and curiosity held them back. Caught between wanting peace and wanting to see how far the man's boldness would carry. Him, the girl, never blended into the shadows. Each time she stepped into the street, even for a bucket of water, the air shifted. She wore no chains now, but her silence spoke louder than any words. Children stared wide, their mothers pulling them away. Old men tipped their hats, unsure whether out of respect or fear. And in her eyes, there was always that same unyielding fire, the kind that dared anyone to decide her fate for her. She had not chosen this town, yet she stood in it as if she belonged as much as any soul who'd ever hammered nails into its boards. The sheriff grew restless. He'd lived long enough to know that towns cracked when pressure built too high. He tried to keep order, walking the streets more often, showing his badge at every corner. But his badge weighed lighter than the fear in men's hearts. He knew a reckoning was near. What he didn't know was who would strike first: the cowboy, the girl's people, or the town itself. One evening, word spread fast that riders had been seen out past the hills. A ranch boy swore he'd spotted shadows moving against the setting sun. It's too many for stray cowhands, too swift for settlers. The saloon emptied into the street as men reached for rifles. The preacher gathered folks at the church, his prayers rising loud enough to rattle the rafters. But the night passed without a raid, and the riders, if they were real, never came closer. The fear didn't fade, though. It dug deeper, sharpening suspicion, turning every glance into a question. The showman, who had started this whole mess, tried once more to steer the town's mood. He spun tales about opportunity, about how the cowboy's choice was his own affair and none of theirs. But he spoke with the desperation of a man trying to sell rotten fruit. No one listened. The town's patience with his schemes had soured, and now folks looked at him with the same mistrust they gave the girl. He'd brought fire into their streets. No smile or fast talk could undo it. Inside the cowboy's shack, nights were heavy with silence. He and the girl spoke little, but each carried the weight of thoughts unspoken. Sometimes he caught her staring out the window toward the plains, her face calm but her eyes restless. Sometimes she caught him watching her, his jaw set, as if he were bracing himself against questions he knew she deserved to ask. Neither reached across that distance. They lived in the same space, but carried different storms inside them. One night, as coyotes howled far off, the girl finally spoke. Her words were quiet, steady, her voice carrying the weight of something long held back. She asked why he had chosen her? Why he had stood before a crowd and pointed to a woman in chains when easier choices stood beside her. He did not answer right away. The silence stretched heavy and sharp. When he did speak, his voice was low, almost a whisper. He said there were debts a man could not ignore, debts carved into the soul deeper than any wound, but he did not explain further. She listened, her face unreadable, then turned her eyes back to the dark plains, as if the horizon might offer clearer truth than his words. The sheriff watched all of this unfold with growing unease. He heard the talk in the saloon, the rumors in the store, the whispered prayers in the church. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone forced a decision. Either the town would demand the girl be sent away, or the Comanche would ride down to reclaim her, or the cowboy himself would draw the line in blood. None of those paths promised peace, but one of them was coming. And soon. The tension deepened when a rancher's herd was found slaughtered out beyond the creek. Arrows were pulled from the carcasses, and though no one saw who fired them, the message was clear enough. The town gathered that night, voices rising in anger and fear. Some called for war, others begged for caution, but all eyes turned to the cowboy's shack at the edge of town. They blamed him, blamed her, blamed the choice that had brought shadows closer to their door. The sheriff tried to calm them, but his words fell on ears already sharpened for conflict. The crowd wanted answers, wanted someone to bear the weight of their fear. And so, they spoke of torches, of driving the pair out before worse came down on them. The preacher tried to remind them of mercy, but mercy was thin in a place where survival demanded hard edges. That night, lanterns bobbed like fireflies as men gathered in the street, their hands tight on rifles, their faces grim. The sheriff stood in their path, his hand resting near his holster, his voice steady as he warned them what violence could bring. But he saw the set of their jaws, the hunger in their eyes, and he knew words alone might not hold them back. In the shack, the cowboy loaded his rifle in silence while the girl stood at the window, watching the glow of lanterns draw closer. She did not speak, but her presence was unshaken, her stance as steady as when she had stood in chains before the town. She knew this night was only the beginning, and she knew the choice that had been made for her was now a choice for all of them. The air thickened, heavy with smoke from torches and the weight of unspoken truths. The sheriff's voice rose one last time in warning. The crowd shouted back, and the cowboy stepped into the doorway with the rifle balanced in his hands. The girl stood behind him, her eyes sharp as flint, her silence more dangerous than any cry. And then the distant sound of hooves split the night. A low thunder rolling across the plains, growing louder, closer, until the very ground beneath their boots trembled. Every face turned toward the horizon. The crowd froze, the sheriff's hand tightened, and the cowboy's eyes narrowed into the dark. The girl's gaze did not waver. The storm had finally come to Dry Creek, and no one yet knew whose blood it would wash away. The thunder of hooves grew closer. Rolling over the plains like a storm that could not be outrun, Dry Creek froze in place. Men, clutching torches, lowered them, their light flickering across tense faces. The sheriff stood firm in the center of the road, hand hovering near his holster, his eyes narrowing into the dark. The cowboy held his rifle steady in the doorway of his shack, the Comanche girl behind him, her face unreadable but her gaze unflinching. The first riders appeared at the edge of town, silhouettes against the moonlit sky. They came fast, a line of shadows breaking into the open, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that drifted into the streets. The town's crowd shifted nervously. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men glanced at one another, uncertain if they stood ready for a fight. Fear had lived in their bellies for days, and now it galloped right into their midst. The riders slowed as they reached the outskirts, their leader raising a hand to halt the line. The night air filled with the sound of horses snorting, hooves pawing the ground, leather creaking under the weight of armed men. Arrows gleamed faint in the torchlight, rifles hung at the ready. No one spoke. Even the coyotes had gone silent. As if the whole land was waiting for the first word to break, the Comanche girl stepped forward, past the cowboy into the doorway's light. Her eyes locked on the leader of the riders. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face painted in streaks of dark and pale. The crowd murmured, shifting uneasily, but the girl did not hesitate. She lifted her chin, her silence breaking at last with a single word spoken in her own tongue. It cut through the night, sharp and strong. Carrying recognition and weight, the leader answered in kind, his voice steady, his eyes flicking past her to the cowboy who stood just behind. Their exchange was brief, words in a language most in Dry Creek could not understand. Yet the meaning hung clear enough. She was one of theirs. And the man beside her, the cowboy who had chosen her, had forced a question no one could avoid. Would she return, or would she remain? The sheriff raised his voice then, calling for calm, his tone firm enough to shake men from the edge of panic. He warned the crowd that a single shot fired without cause would mean blood spilled on both sides. And once that blood ran, there'd be no stopping it. His words carried the weight of law, but more than that. They carried the tired wisdom of a man who'd seen too many graves dug in hard earth. Slowly, torches lowered, rifles eased. Though no man let go of his fear, the cowboy stepped out into the open, rifle still in hand but pointed toward the ground. He met the leader's eyes without flinching. For a long moment, neither moved. The air between them tightened like a rope drawn to breaking. Then the girl's voice rose again, speaking to her people, her words quick, urgent, filled with something more than demand. She was not pleading. She was commanding, her tone carrying the fire she had kept silent for so long. The leader listened, his expression unreadable. His men shifted, their horses restless, but they did not advance. Finally, the leader dismounted, his boots striking the ground with a dull thud. He walked forward until he stood within 10 paces of the cowboy and the girl. The crowd of townsfolk held their breath, not daring to move. What passed then was quiet, too quiet for the crowd to fully catch. The girl spoke again, her words steady, her eyes never leaving the leader's face. The cowboy stood silent beside her, his presence strong but unyielding, as if he knew the choice was not his to make. The leader's gaze shifted between them, weighing something deeper than anger or vengeance. At last he gave a single nod, sharp and final. He turned back to his men, barked an order, and in moments they were pulling their horses away, vanishing into the night as swiftly as they had come. The town exhaled as if waking from a nightmare. Men dropped their shoulders, women clutched children close. The preacher crossed himself, and the sheriff let his hand finally fall from his holster. No blood had been spilled. No war cries had split the night. But the storm had passed only because a line had been drawn in silence and fire, and no one could yet say what it truly meant. The girl remained in the doorway, her face calm, her eyes fixed on the dark horizon where her people had disappeared. The cowboy stood beside her, silent as ever. But there was something in his stance, a weight lifted, or perhaps a burden accepted. The sheriff stepped forward then, his voice rough but steady. He told the crowd to go home, to lay down their rifles, to remember that peace, however fragile, had held. Slowly, reluctantly, they obeyed, drifting back to their homes with the unease of people who knew the world had shifted and would never sit the same again. Days turned into weeks, and Dry Creek settled, though never fully. The showman slipped out of town under cover of dawn, his scheme soured, his name cursed on every lip. The two pale girls found homes with families who had space and kindness enough to give. The preacher spoke of forgiveness more often, though he knew few truly listened. And the sheriff kept walking his rounds, his eyes sharper now, his hand always close to the weight of iron at his hip. The cowboy remained at the edge of town, the girl still at his side. She did not return to the plains, and her people did not return for her. Some said she had chosen him, others whispered he had held her there, but no one knew the truth but the two of them. She began to walk the streets with less fear in the eyes that followed her, and though whispers never fully died, they softened. Children no longer hid when she passed. Men tipped their hats with respect rather than unease. Slowly, the fire she carried seemed less like a threat and more like a reminder that strength came in many forms. The cowboy spoke little, as always, but his presence steadied the town in ways no one expected. He worked, he fought when needed, he stood firm against those who stirred trouble. And always the girl was there, her silence sharper than any blade, her gaze steady as the horizon itself. Together, they carried a story that had nearly broken Dry Creek, but instead had remade it. In the end, the town learned something it hadn't sought to learn. That peace was not found in chains or bargains, not in fear or suspicion, but in choices made with courage. Even when those choices carried risk, the girl's silence had been her shield, the cowboy's choice his burden. And together, they had forced the town to look at itself and see the truth it had tried to ignore years later. When riders passed through and asked about the Comanche girl who had once stood shackled on a dusty porch, the townsfolk told the tale with lowered voices. They spoke of the cowboy who chose her, of the night the riders came, of the silence that held stronger than gunfire. Some told it as a warning, others as a lesson. But all told it as something worth remembering. And out on the plains, where the wind carried stories farther than any man could ride, whispers told of a girl who had been taken but had not been broken, of a man who had stood beside her, and of a town that had been tested and forever changed. Dry Creek lived on, scarred but steadied, holding the memory of that night in its bones. And the cowboy and the Comanche girl remained, not as legend, not as myth, but as two souls bound by choice and chance. Their story written in dust and silence. In fire and calm, the storm had come, and the storm had passed. What it left behind was not ruin, but something harder, something truer. A reminder that even in the harshest places, strength and defiance could shape the world in ways no one expected. And so their story ended. Not in blood, but in memory, etched into the land, carried by the wind, and told in quiet voices long after the dust had settled.